In the previous episode, we saw how violence ceased to be chaotic and began to organize itself. The first permanent groups of fighters emerged, along with hierarchy and discipline. At that moment, war stopped being merely a reaction to danger. In this episode, we will show how something much larger grew out of this organized violence: the first states. When violence became organized and subordinated to a permanent structure, its role in society changed. Previously, war had been a response to a specific threat: an attack by neighbors, a lack of resources, the need to defend a settlement. Now it became a tool that could be planned, controlled, and used over the long term. This was a turning point. An organized group of fighters required constant maintenance. It had to be fed, equipped, and controlled. This meant the need to accumulate surpluses and manage them continuously. At this point, power ceased to be temporary. It was no longer needed only in times of danger. It became a permanent element of social life. Whoever decided about resources decided about the army. Whoever decided about the army decided about security. And whoever decided about security very quickly began to decide about everything else. In this way, violence and power became permanently linked. This connection was not ideological or planned. It was practical. Communities that were able to maintain control over violence were more stable and more effective. They could defend their borders, but they could also impose their will on others. Over time, the need arose to regulate life within the community. If the army was subordinated to a single decision-making center, that center also had to resolve disputes, enforce decisions, and maintain order. Violence became the ultimate argument standing behind every decision. In this sense, the state did not emerge as an idea, but as a structure for managing violence. With the emergence of permanent power and an army, a new logic of social organization appeared. Borders ceased to be fluid. They began to be defended and guarded. Territory gained political significance, not just practical value. Control over land meant control over people and resources. This required administration, even in a very primitive form. Someone had to count supplies, allocate labor, and enforce decisions. At this point, war ceased to be only an external threat. It became a tool of expansion. If an army existed, it could be used to seize new lands, acquire resources, and subjugate other communities. This changed the dynamics of conflict. War began to drive the development of state structures, and state structures began to drive war. A mechanism emerged that was very difficult to reverse. Maintaining an army required resources, and acquiring resources often led to further conflicts. Violence became normalized as an element of order. Obedience to authority began to be justified by security. The community ceased to be a collection of equal individuals. It became a hierarchy in which power held a monopoly on violence. This was the foundation of statehood. Not constitutions, not written law, but the ability to enforce decisions. At this moment, human history entered a new phase. Conflicts ceased to be local and occasional. They became a permanent element of relations between organized communities. War became a tool of politics before politics itself existed in the form we recognize today. From a long-term perspective, it is clear that the state and war developed together. Each reinforced the other. The state provided an organizational framework for violence, and war legitimized the existence of the state. This mechanism repeats itself across different eras and cultures, regardless of ideology or belief systems. This does not mean that war was the only possible path of social development, but it does mean that under certain conditions, it was the most effective one. Understanding this process allows us to view the rest of history differently. Wars, empires, borders, and power are not anomalies. They are consequences of very old mechanisms that were activated the moment violence became organized. This mini-series has traced the path from the first chaotic clashes through the birth of armies to the emergence of the state as a structure of control. This closes the first stage of our story about history as a system. In future series, we will return to these mechanisms in different eras and contexts, because although the tools and scale change, the underlying logic remains surprisingly similar. War did not appear suddenly, nor was it the result of a single moment. It was a process that gradually transformed the way human societies were organized, from chaos through the army to the state. Understanding this process helps us better understand not only the past, but also the world we live in today.